Welcome everyone and good afternoon. Welcome to the Today's Dietitian Learning Library webinar, Decoding Prebiotics Using a Patient-Centered Approach. I'm Leslie Samay, Director of Professional Development at GVP, publishers of Today's Dietitian, and I'm your host for today's webinar. Before we start the presentation, I have my usual points of housekeeping. First, in order to claim credit, you have to stay with us through the whole presentation, 1 hour long. Second, at the end of the session, our presenter is going to take the questions. If you have a question, please type it in the Q&A box in the lower Zoom menu. We'll try to address as many questions as we can. Thirdly, Heather Rasmussen, PhD, RDN, faculty for this event, has no relevant financial relationships with ineligible companies to disclose. None of the planners for this educational activity have relevant financial relationships with ineligible companies to disclose. And the definition of an ineligible company includes any entity whose primary business is producing, marketing, selling, reselling, or distributing healthcare products used by or on patients. And finally, in support of improving patient care, Great Valley Publishing Company is jointly accredited by the Accreditation Council for Continuing Medical Education, the Accreditation Council for Pharmacy Education, and the American Nurses Credentialing Center to provide continuing education for the healthcare team. This activity will also award credit for dietetics. Today's webinar is brought to you with support from the National Honey Board, an industry-funded agriculture promotion group that educates consumers about the benefits and uses of honey. The vision of the National Honey Board is to inspire a passion for honey and an appreciation for the honeybees that make it possible. For more information, visit honey.com. And now I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Heather Rasmussen. Dr. Rasmussen is an associate professor in the Department of Nutrition and Health Sciences at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, and she's the director of the Professional Studies Dietetics Program and Ascend Accredited Future Education Model Graduate Program. Her research interests include how dietary factors such as prebiotics and whole foods influence gut milieu, including microbiota, intestinal permeability, and gut-derived inflammation, and how this impacts systemic health. And so with that, now I'm pleased to turn it over to Dr. Rasmussen.
Thank you, Leslie, for that introduction. Thank you, everyone, for coming. First, I'm going to say that I am going to turn off my video just so you can focus on the presentation, and I'll turn it back on when we get to the question and answer session. So today I'm going to talk to you about prebiotics. Now, this probably isn't the first, maybe the first presentation you've seen, or there may be other presentations coming up because it is a very popular topic right now. And so I want to make sure that I talk to you about it in a way that, is maybe also a little bit different. So I'm not only going to talk to you about the definition of prebiotics, but also is that how do you really fit those into a diet that is, I would say, also aligned for gastrointestinal health. So I'll go straight to the beginning of my presentation. Now, I would be remiss to talk about prebiotics if I didn't first talk about gastrointestinal health, because that's the way in which they work, is that they work in the gastrointestinal tract to improve the health of the gastrointestinal tract, but also the individual. So before, I would say the last maybe couple decades, the criteria for a healthy gastrointestinal tract really focused on the absence of GI illness. And I'm looking at the Q&A to make sure that it's not directed at me. So, so basically we used to think of GI health as not having a disease. So maybe we don't have inflammatory bowel disease, celiac disease, maybe we don't have colorectal cancer, and otherwise we'd have a healthy gastrointestinal tract. Now, I think if those of you who are attending that you're a registered dietitian or a nutrition professional, that you also understand the importance of effective digestion and absorption of food. So appropriate nutrient absorption, stool transit time, stool consistency are all things that we I think deal with maybe not on a daily basis, but quite frequently. But what's unique about this more recent definition of a healthy gastrointestinal tract is that microbiota and these other factors really play into what's considered healthy. So I am saying normal but we largely think that, maybe we don't quite yet know what normal is for microbiota. But we have some ideas of which bacteria may be better for you and maybe not quite as good. So we think about bacterial growth, what is the composition and the diversity of that bacteria. So effective immune status. For effective immune status, we think about barrier function. We think about immune cell activity, and also can't forget about immune tolerance. So I'll talk to you a little bit about barrier function because it plays an important role in that relationship between your gastrointestinal tract and yourself. And then lastly, this is something else that's been really, I say, popular or discussed more recently, is this idea of well-being. So if you've heard the term your brain-gut axis, then this addresses that. So it's just the idea of that your gastrointestinal tract and your brain really communicate closely. And so your health of your gastrointestinal tract could impact your cognition or your mood, but it could be the other way around. And so it could be your mood affecting your gastrointestinal tract. And so all these come together are criteria for a healthy gastrointestinal tract. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit more about the microbiota piece of that and also relation to this immune piece. So microbiota, I'm sure you've heard the term and have an idea of generally what it is, but I'll give you a little bit of a reminder here. It's a large functionally stable community of bacteria. Now, it's not, when we talk about this, it's not just bacteria, there's also other microorganisms. We think about viruses, but for this purpose, we're really focusing on the bacteria because it makes up quite a bit of the microbiota. And so we have 40 trillion microbial cells, equal to that of human cells, like your somatic cells. So if you think about that, that's pretty impressive. And we have around 1,000 bacterial species in the gastrointestinal microbiota that make that up, and give or take 160 per person. And so microbiota itself has a very important role within the gastrointestinal tract and for our health. So we know that it impacts nutrient metabolism. So for example, plays a role in vitamin K metabolism, B12 metabolism, but also has a role in barrier function, which again is this kind of this gateway from your gastrointestinal tract to your body. Also a role in the immune system. And importantly, there's a modulation in the microbiota that can happen at a young age. And so this is really a key period, like for the first, even in utero, but the first year or two of life, where we really can make a big difference on one's immune system in this young age. So if you think about, it could be mode of delivery, it could be antibiotic use, breastfeeding versus formula feeding, what complementary foods are given. And so this is we talk about the formative years. This is really formative when it relates to the gut bacteria. And so in relation to prebiotics today, we don't normally talk about them as much when we talk about maybe that infant period, unless we're talking about the human milk oligosaccharides, which are the ones that are in breast milk. And I'm actually not focusing on that today, but just want you to let you know it is very important. And so you can see in the picture on the right that you can see your small and large intestine. And what I want to emphasize here is that a bulk of the microbiota is found in the large intestine and mostly in the colon towards the rectum. And so when we're measuring microbiota, when we're collecting that, unless you're doing it luminally, if you're collecting in stool, then a lot of that bacteria is really representative of that for the large intestine. So why do we even talk about microbiota? So, we've had it forever, but so why is it a thing that we talk about now? Well, a lot of it has to do with the new techniques, and I say new, it's been now maybe 20 years, but newer techniques of how we can measure microbiota. And so we do this, we could do this clinically, we do it in research. And so we ask people to collect stool. There's various ways to do this. Some are easier than others. And then we take that stool and we extract bacteria. And then we look at that bacterial genome. And then it's you go through a process where you sequence it and you run bioinformatics and you identify the species that are present. And so, what are your outputs of this? So when you start off with stool, what are we looking for and trying to get out of this? So lots of different things, but some examples. So we're looking at the gut bacteria, and one of the common measures is like relative abundance. So how much bacteria relative, like maybe to the total bacteria, other bacteria. What is the diversity? So greater diversity is largely considered more desirable. And then we can look at bacteria and see how it clusters in individuals to see maybe, for example, the impact of treatment or some sort of supplementation. But we can also look at a functional analysis. So it's not just, what is the gene, what's the DNA, but what is it doing? So we can look at RNA, we can look at some of the functional pieces. And this leads to what I'm going to talk about in a minute, which relates to prebiotics, is short chain fatty acids. So before that, though, on the left-hand side, I have the beneficial bacteria listed. And I say that as a term of beneficial bacteria, but here are just some examples of bacteria that have been linked to some positive outcomes and maybe can produce short chain fatty acids, which is related to prebiotics. So why do we care about this? Why do we care about microbiota and what's our composition and our diversity? Really because that evidence more recently has linked this to our overall health. And so the thought is, if we have more of what I'm going to call here good bacteria and less of bad bacteria, then we may be more likely to have better health and less disease. And I have this in quotes because there's still a lot of uncertainty about what is on the beneficial side, what maybe is on the negative side. We have some ideas of some bacteria, some listed here, of what has been linked to health and maybe also to poor health. So here's where I'm showing you a little bit more about these short chain fatty acids that I mentioned. And so again, it's not that we can just measure microbiota, but we can also measure the products of microbiota, so short chain fatty acids, and I have them listed here. So these are the 3 primary fatty acids that are products of microbial processing or digestion. So we have propionate, acetate, and butyrate. And these have been linked to health. So I have on the right-hand side listed glucose metabolism, lipid metabolism, satiety. So there's been some evidence for some of these short chain fatty acids to be linked to these in a beneficial way. Now, some of this can be through if there are actions on the gut barrier. Some may be, other actions, but we talk a lot about how they impact the gastrointestinal tract and its barrier. I just want to mention that butyrate is one that's probably talked about most often because it can be beneficial for the gut barrier. So it can, I'm going to say, strengthen the gut barrier so that we don't have a barrier that's letting compounds in that we don't want to get in. And so largely overall, one of these, the benefits of having short chain fatty acids, and the microbiota that produce them, is an anti-inflammatory function. And we all know that we've talked that we know that inflammation is one of the cornerstones of disease. And so this is important. So here's just a little bit more about short chain fatty acids and the intestinal barrier. And so this is showing you on the left that short chain fatty acid producing bacteria will then produce short chain fatty acids, which really help our gut barrier be appropriately tight. So you can see that these epithelial cells, which are just a single layer within our gastrointestinal tract, they need to be tight to not let in things we don't want to be let in. So short chain fatty acids can do this through increasing mucus production, increasing tight junction proteins, reducing growth of pathogenic bacteria, and working to regulate the immune system. So if we don't have as much of these maybe bacteria that produce the short chain fatty acids, maybe we have bacteria that don't, then we could have a situation where we have what I would say we could call a leaky gut. You might hear that term more in like a layperson sense, but it is a term we use if we talk about increased intestinal permeability. So that just allows compounds such as LPS or lipopolysaccharide to come through and increase inflammation within the system, which has some negative consequences. So now I've given you a little bit of a background on the gastrointestinal tract and microbiota, why it's important in these products. And so how does this relate to our dietary patterns and our fiber and our prebiotics? So this is where I'm going to talk more about, like, if we're a nutrition professional, like, what do we do about this? And I'm going to include prebiotics in that. So this is a figure that we adapted from Armet and others in 2022. And I thought it was a very nice article, so I wanted to include it. So the article talks about dietary intake for gut health. And this relates to prebiotics, but it also goes, a little bit outside of that as well. And so I'm going to spend just a minute on it because I think these pieces are important and also very interesting. So if we look on the left-hand side, we have whole plant foods. And so why are whole plant foods good for our gastrointestinal health? And so you can see there's lots of different mechanisms, but one that's central to what talk about today is, if you look straight down in the middle, there's dietary fibers. And so I will explain to you in a minute that dietary fibers the term is not necessarily synonymous with prebiotics, but I think, the fact is that fiber consumption, depending on the type of fiber, can produce these short chain fatty acids that I just talked about. So you can see in the middle, this short chain fatty acid production can enhance barrier function, like I said, and increase mucus degradation, impact the tight junction proteins in a positive way, and then help with bacterial encroachment. So these can all be done. The consumption of fibers can lead to short chain fatty acids, which can have some beneficial effects. I importantly want to mention, this relates to prebiotics, is also in that side are phytochemicals. So for example, you could think of this as like say polyphenols. They also play actually a really interesting role in the gastrointestinal tract and health. They need the microbiota to transform them to be bioavailable. And so the bacteria help with that, but also as a result, then there's products that can help with both the health of our gastrointestinal tract, but also our systemic health. And so in summary of this, the consumption of whole plant foods can really lower chronic disease risk. And some of this happens definitely through the gastrointestinal tract. And I'm not going to talk as much about this opposite side with processed foods, but this idea is that if we're not eating as much whole plant foods, and instead we're eating more of the processed foods. And I know that processed foods can be defined in different ways, and there's lots of different foods that fall under the umbrella. But if you think about maybe some of the foods that are shown here, then there could be actual components of those foods that may have detrimental effects on gastrointestinal health. So having a impaired barrier function, but also it could be just the lack of these dietary fibers that do make short chain fatty acids, which then increase the chance of having impaired barrier function. And so all this can contribute to chronic disease risk. And so when we're talking about diet as it relates to gastrointestinal health, so I've just mentioned that overall dietary patterns are very important, but one of the key pieces in that is the fiber consumption. And one type of fiber often, and I'll clarify, is this idea of these prebiotics. So I've listed here 4 terms that are commonly used, but they are used to describe different types of compounds that are beneficial for health. So I would assume the first one, probiotics, is familiar to you, and this is not what the talk is about today, but I think it's important to distinguish the difference. So probiotics are live microorganisms that, when administered in adequate amounts, confer a health benefit on the host. So today the focus is prebiotics. So it's a substrate that is selectively utilized by host microorganisms, conferring a health benefit. So when we, in a way, combine probiotics and prebiotics, we could get something that we term a symbiotic. So if we mix a live microorganism and a substrate that actually is consumed by that microorganism, then we could have something that works together for health benefit. And then postbiotics, we're not going to talk about that today, but it is a term that's used. So there's, just know there's other compounds that may have a benefit on the host, and these are related to microorganisms. I want to point out, I'm going to talk now more about the prebiotic definition, but if you look at all of these, and I've bolded this, they all say conferring or a health benefit. So in order for anything to be considered in one of these categories, they have to actually have a health benefit. So they can't just, for example, change the profile of bacteria. There has to be an outcome that we can identify. And also, I think the definition of prebiotics, it's gone through a bunch of iterative process, such that this is the definition that is put forth by the International Scientific Association for pro and prebiotics. So it is I would say the most accepted definition of prebiotics. So here I'm going to break it down a little bit more because I think it is, it's important to identify these distinct parts that make it something a prebiotic. And so the first thing would be that it's a substrate. So it's often a fiber, but it's not always fiber. But if it is a fiber, then it's a fermentable one. And so what do I mean by fermentable? And I'm not going to talk you through this because that's not key for what we're talking about, but it's this understanding that really you actually take that fiber, and then it's actually metabolized by the bacteria through several processes, and then the actual end product is our beneficial products of the fermentation. So this is where we get our short chain fatty acids, our propionate, our acetate, our butyrate. And so the bacteria actually possess what they call cazymes. So enzymes that break down the bacteria to produce these short chain fatty acids. There's also other products that produce, so we need to remember that when we recommend prebiotics or other fibers that are fermentable, that there could be some, maybe like gas production, for example, and that depends on the fiber. I've listed here just a bacteria just for the purpose of understanding like how important to certain bacteria these fibers are. So in some bacteria, for example, 18% of genome is for polysaccharide utilization. So this is a big role for these bacteria. And these bacteria don't work in isolation. So product of one fermentation process could be a substrate of another. And so we think about that when you're talking about supplementation, if one maybe a probiotic or, that all these, it goes into this pool where they all work together. So it's a little bit more complicated than, than one would think maybe on the surface. And again, this idea, this fermentation process by this, that results from the prebiotic consumption must then impact the host in a positive way. So going back to this definition, so we've talked about the substrate has to be something that the bacteria can utilize. So we'd say it's fermentable. In order to be a prebiotic, then there's a selectivity component so that this prebiotic has to modify only select bacteria. So if there's global changes in microbiota, this doesn't count. And so even if it's like a really broad change in some beneficial bacteria, then by definition, it needs to be very purposeful, like select modification of bacteria. The last one, which is incredibly important, is that there has to be a direct link to health, benefiting human health. And this has to happen through microbiota regulation, excuse me, modulation. And what is a health benefit? I'll show you a few examples here in a minute, but it could be related to the gastrointestinal tract. It could be related to a chronic disease, risk factors for chronic disease, mental health. So that's fairly broad, I would say. So I'm going to break this down a little bit more because to me, this is where I think it's the most unclear. If you haven't really read about this topic in detail. So if you look at this, what I'm trying to do is separate out fibers from fermentable fibers from prebiotics. So I have the definition of a fiber on the top. At least this is a partial definition. And I think most of us have an understanding that generally fiber is a compound or something that is consumed that the small intestine cannot utilize. And so that it escapes that digestion and gets to your large intestine where it can function in some way. And so we think of fiber as being mostly soluble and insoluble. But there's other ways to describe fiber. That may not be the best way when you talk like physiologically how to describe fiber. That's generally what we tend to do. So one way we can describe it as it relates to prebiotics and gastrointestinal health is that we could talk about it as, is it a fermentable fiber? So I just talked about fermentation. So it's this process that the fiber can then be metabolized by bacteria and thus stimulate the growth and activity of this bacteria. And this bacteria is beneficial bacteria. And so I have underneath fermentable fiber the term MAC. And so this stands for microbiota, accessible carbohydrates. So this is a term I'm mentioning because you might see it used. I would say it's similar to fermentable fiber. It really takes into account that each person's different. So the carbohydrates that are accessible to some people, to the microbiota may be a little different depending on the individual. And then so largely within this fermentable fiber, this fiber realm is this term prebiotics. So I've defined it here. We defined it previously. So it is different again because it's selectively utilized, but also it confers a health benefit. And so it's a subset of fermentable fiber, which is a subset of fiber. Now, the other piece of it that I think is interesting is that not all prebiotics are fibers. So there's some would term it candidate prebiotics. So most of the evidence lies within this fiber realm for prebiotics, but there's also prebiotics that are outside of that. So for example, phytochemicals within like polyphenols, and then also CLA or conjugated linoleic acid or polyunsaturated fatty acids. So these have been shown to have some effects on select effects on microbiota and also some health benefit. So if we look a little bit more about really breaking this down, because again, I think this is not always clear. So I've in this way broken it down the same way where I have fiber, fermentable fiber, and then prebiotics. But in here, I've given you some examples. And so we have inulin. I'm not going to read them all, but under the fiber, we have, for example, inulin, fructooligosaccharides, galactooligosaccharides, HMOs, and then we have a continued list of different types or different ways that we describe fiber. So if you bring it over to the center and you go into this fermentable fiber category, or this microbiota accessible carbohydrates, maybe we could say, then some of these they drop out. So if we look at the difference, we see that cellulose isn't in there, psyllium isn't in there, bran isn't in there. I will say that I think some of this may depend on how this fiber is processed. So maybe if the psyllium, like cellulose, is found on the ground or the bran is found on the ground, it's not saying that the bacteria cannot access it at all and do something with it, but largely we don't categorize it as fermentable. And I want to mention psyllium just because I feel like that's, as a dietitian, that we tend to recommend psyllium a lot. And I think because I've been in the cardiovascular world in the past, and with cholesterol, psyllium is largely not fermentable, but there is some evidence to show it can ferment to some degree, but we usually don't kind of put it in that category. And then again, moving over to prebiotics, you see all those other ones that, as I said, fall out. And so the core prebiotics have the most evidence is the inulins, the fructooligosaccharides, galactooligosaccharides, and then these human milk oligosaccharides. And so a couple points I want to make here I have below is, a lot of times we look at literature, and I'm just going to show you a couple examples of this, is that they're often tested in isolation. So what's the impact of inulin, which I think is perfectly fine. But I think overall, we want to think about, what about a combination of fermentable fibers that may be important? And whether that's, I'm not saying it has to be even supplement, but through diet and variety in diet, then you could accomplish that. And then, as with any dietary intervention, response to all these fibers are individualized. And so what's good for some person may not be as good for someone else. It doesn't mean it'll be negative, it just may not be as beneficial. So I don't want to forget about the other, again, candidate prebiotics that aren't fiber. And so as an example, I've adapted a table that we had published some time ago, about polyphenols in relation to cardiovascular disease. And so the point I want to make here is that there's a wide variety of polyphenols. Again, bacteria metabolize these, making them more bioavailable to us. So that is great for us. The bacteria will do that for us. But so these are, some can be considered to have some prebiotic capacity, so modulation of the gut bacteria. And so you look at, I have different categories. So both polyphenol classes, but also the amount polyphenol in milligrams per serving within these. And you can just kind of see how, for example, like black beans, there's anthocyanins, there's phenolic acids, there's flavanols, so they fall within many different categories. So they could modify various, consumption of that might modify bacteria in various ways, which could be beneficial. So again, it's not, I'm going to tell you this multiple times here coming up, is that it's not just the focus on, consumption of a prebiotic. I think that it's good to think about that in the context of the entire diet and how we incorporate these whole foods into that entire picture. So I'm not going to spend the rest of the time exactly talking about just prebiotics and individual health benefits, but I want to give you a sampling of that. There is fairly extensive evidence on the specific prebiotics that I've mentioned, which I'll show you. And there's also some good papers on that you could reference as well. So we do know that prebiotics can beneficially impact health. And so if you look at this figure, so what we're concerned about is a situation where we may not have a bacterial profile that may be as beneficial for health as it could be. And so we could use the term dysbiosis. We don't always use that term, but it is used. That could be related then to gut leakiness, so having an intestinal barrier that may not be where we want it to be, which could lead to a situation of having inflammation that comes from the gut, which can contribute to systemic inflammation and thus impaired metabolic health. And so you can see that I've listed prebiotics, probiotics, and biotics on the left-hand side. And our focus, of course, is these prebiotics. And so it's thought that prebiotics can, help with these things by various mechanisms, but one being through this production of short-chain fatty acids. And of course, here one could also put like healthful dietary pattern alongside these options for dietary measures. But here I'm just focusing on the prebiotics. And so here's just a general summary of the health impacts of prebiotics. And so I've selected a few of these that are solidly in the prebiotic category. So inulin, fructooligosaccharides, galactooligosaccharides. And I listed some examples of health benefits. So again, with that definition that you have to have a concrete health benefit. But you can see from this that it can vary quite a bit. So it could be related to stool consistency and frequency. It could be related to improved calcium absorption. There's been a variety of benefit for metabolic health, so in various aspects. So it's body weight or serum lipids or glucose, and also some related like central to the gut, so barrier function, for example. What I think I just want to point out here quickly is that for all of these, there's some evidence for improvement of some sort of bowel habit, which I find interesting because we think about adding fiber and, sometimes we have to just be very cautious about that. And we think, oh, maybe if something ferments and rapidly that it may cause GI distress. So I think that could happen, but there's actually benefit of consuming these fermentable carbohydrates for that concern. So all I did here is pull out an article. So we all know that one article doesn't, define how something works necessarily, but I just chose this one article and I chose inulin. I could have chosen a different prebiotic. But I thought this was interesting, a study that had 44 participants for 18 weeks, and they had a weight loss phase for the first 9 weeks, and then a weight maintenance phase after that. They had a registered dietitian that helped, and the goal is for a 5% weight loss during the weight loss phase. And so what they did was they compared individuals that had 30 grams of inulin to those that had 30 grams of cellulose. Now, I will say that is quite a bit of inulin, and I'll tell you in a minute that sometimes we can have less. But this is what they had done. And so they found in the weight loss, for weight loss, that the inulin group had greater weight loss actually in the weight maintenance phase. So they continued to lose weight, whereas the cellulose group did not. And then looked at body composition in the individuals. They had lower both hepatic and soleus muscle fat, so the back of the calf, content after the weight maintenance phase in the group with inulin as well. So this is just, again, an example to show, maybe there's a difference within the type of fibers on some of these health parameters. So I gave the example of 30 grams, but if we look at prebiotic sources and think like, okay, how do we, again, from a practical perspective, how do we look at this? And so we have various options, right? So we have fortified foods, we have supplements, we have whole foods. So if we start on the left-hand side, we could find added fiber, added fermentable fiber, added prebiotics in things like granola bars, in cereal. We can find in infant formula, we can have also prebiotics specifically. So we have galacto-oligosaccharides in some infant formulas. There's also these available as supplements as well. And so instead of putting it in foods, it's, you get the opportunity to put it in foods or in water. And so on the flip side, though, we think about, maybe someone isn't as interested in consuming something that's a supplement or that has something added to it. The question is like, can we get enough prebiotics from whole foods? Because I think whoever talks about prebiotics says, oh, we can, prebiotics can be found in bananas, onions, garlics, and Jerusalem artichokes, and leeks is often quoted, which is very valid. I mean, that is a very true statement. It's just hard to get enough of it to get to that level of making a difference. So it doesn't mean we can't do it, but it takes some effort. And so I have here on the bottom, on the left-hand side, added prebiotics or supplements to get 5 grams a day. So what that's really saying is that overall, the general statement, and this comes from the ISAP, that International Scientific Association for Pro and Prebiotics, is if we can get maybe 5 grams a day of prebiotics, that could have a health benefit. And that is a combination of foods and supplements. And so thinking about this from a approach where it's a food, centered approach. So can we do this through diet? I just said it's hard to get that enough, but there was a recent study looking at giving this type of diet. So 15 grams of inulin type fructans through vegetable consumption. And so what they did was they took 26 participants. It was a single group trial. And basically they did a 2-week trial, and they physically gave these individuals the foods to eat. And so what they found was that the consumption of artichokes, leeks, onions, garlic did increase the proportion of bifidobacterium genus. So that's, changing the microbiota. And they also saw an increase in satiety with this diet and reduced desire to eat sweet, salty, and fatty food. One thing I will note, they mentioned that for the bifidobacterium, the change they saw, they looked 3 weeks later and the changes were reversed. And so I think that brings up an important point, just like anything else we do. So if we stop doing it, the benefit isn't there any longer. So if we're going to take prebiotics, then we need to keep doing them to have that effect on the bacteria and then on our health. So I mentioned before that I wanted to do this in a kind of a holistic approach, like dietary patterns that are also important. And so my question is like, when we talk about prebiotics and diets for gut health, is that different than what we'd recommend like normally to our patients? And so here's another example of our dietary pattern for gut health. And it should be similar to that figure I showed you before, but it's just broken down a little bit more. And so this ideal pattern for gut health is eating fruits and vegetables, whole grains, plant-based protein foods, fatty fish, and then low-fat and fermented dairy products. And so you can see here that, again, the effects are related to these phytochemicals in the presence of dietary fibers. Not included here is the flip side of maybe limiting some of the meat, processed meat, maybe some higher fat dairy as well. And so when you look at what's shown here, from the dietary guidelines, we all know, I think, what a healthful dietary pattern looks like, and this can vary. Now, this shows you the healthy US style dietary pattern, and then anything on the Mediterranean vegetarian are just variations. And so anything that's a number just means it's a little bit different than what the healthy US style is. And so what I'm really trying to emphasize here is that there's a lot of commonalities between these dietary patterns that we recommend. So between the healthy US style, a Mediterranean, which does have a little bit more focus maybe on fish and olive oil. And of course, vegetarian is a little bit different, but still, focus on beans and whole grains and fruits and vegetables, nuts and seeds. And so there's these commonalities here. And that I would argue that these commonalities really overlap with the diet for gut health. And I think this can be emphasized. There's been a few studies that have come out about dietary patterns in gut health. And so I just have two quick examples here of one Mediterranean diet intervention, reducing plasma cholesterol, increasing genes for microbial carbohydrate degradation that are linked to butyrate metabolism, and also some changes in microbiota that are linked to insulin sensitivity, and then one about Mediterranean diet being associated with fiber degrading microbiota and lower levels of gut inflammation. So my take on this is that likely that a microbiota favorable dietary pattern lies within the currently recommended dietary patterns, secondary to combination of beneficial dietary components. And so I think that, we can rest easy in that what we generally recommend is like maybe, the Mediterranean dietary pattern or the US style dietary pattern will also be beneficial for gut health. And on the same vein of having these common diets that are beneficial for everyone, I also wanted just to mention here, because I find it very important, is that, I think more and more talk about sustainability. So, it's not just what's good for our health, but what's good for the health of the planet. And some of you may have read the Eat Lancet Commission put out a report in 2019 about what do we need to do, what kind of diets do we need to have globally to be able to keep the planet healthy, or maybe make it a little more healthy. So this is just the quote: transformation to healthy diets by 2050 will require substantial dietary shifts. Global consumption of fruits, vegetables, nuts, and legumes will have to double, and consumption of foods such as red meat and sugar will have to be reduced by more than 50%. A diet rich in plant-based foods with fewer animal source foods confers both improved health and environmental benefits. And I think this is further emphasized by this figure. So this was a figure from that report, adapted from that report. And that shows you what percent of your diet should be from which category. So it's not going to align maybe exactly with what we say with a Mediterranean pattern per se, but it's pretty darn close to what we're saying is good for health in general, for chronic disease, and also specific to gut health. And so we have a lot of fruits and vegetables, whole grains, plant source protein, focusing on those unsaturated fats. And so I think that when we think about sustainable diets, and I think as a registered dietitian, we like to look at the whole person and, make sure that that individual is, healthful in many different ways. So I like this idea of a sustainable diet, which has low environmental impacts, contributes to food security, prevents or promotes life for future generations, respectful of biodiversity and ecosystems, is culturally acceptable, accessible, and economically fair and affordable, and also, nutritionally adequate, safe, and healthy. So I believe that, we can think about diet for gut health as a diet for our whole health, and our diet a pattern that's good for planetary health as well. And so how does this relate to prebiotics? So we're talking about prebiotics, and I really want to emphasize them as like a component of a healthful dietary pattern that also impacts your gastrointestinal health. But I think if focusing on this healthful dietary pattern should be first and foremost, but that the addition of a fermentable fiber or prebiotics may be useful to close this fiber gap. So we talk about fiber gaps, so that, what is the difference between what we eat and what is recommended. And so it may be that, with our dietary pattern, we can't quite get there. And so having that fermentable fiber or prebiotics may be useful. And now I purposely put fermentable fiber or prebiotics because I think that, we go with the evidence, right? So we know that specific prebiotics are beneficial for health based on the evidence. So it gives us, a more narrow selection, but that doesn't negate the importance and the benefit of other fermentable fibers. And it could be that, at some point they could be put in that category with more evidence. So I've tried to approach this from an application or patient perspective throughout this, but I am going to do just a little bit of more direct application, and I'm going to stick with inulin just because I've already talked about it. Doesn't mean like supporting inulin over others necessarily, just for consistency. So very specific example. So just trying to, again, bring it home to like what we may see. So let's say you have someone coming into your office interested in weight loss, 58-year-old female, BMI of 29, interested in losing weight for daughter's wedding. So you do a diet history, some sort of recall or typical intake, and this patient reports she's consuming adequate fruits, not eating a lot of vegetables. Diets is high in refined grains because family's really just not accepting of food that isn't maybe like a white bread or white pasta. Family enjoys nightly sweets together. It's bonding time. Based on what their reported intake and maybe the BMI, the energy intake is slightly probably above energy needs. Labs are within normal limit except glucose 112 milligrams per deciliter. So I have that last part just to put her in that pre-diabetes category for this example. And that's because that original paper I talked about was in individuals that had pre-diabetes. So just think about this. So if someone comes to you, is looking for weight loss, like do you think that you want to do this with a prebiotic approach? Of course, one, you would have to dig into all the literature, make sure that you know exactly what it all says and not just one brief presentation. But I think there could be potential for maybe a gut-centered approach. And as I mentioned, the nice thing about this is that it's also like, it aligns with what one would probably recommend anyway. And so I would say, of course, instead of just going to some sort of supplement, then I would say, okay, let's talk about, your dietary pattern. And as we know, that we don't load the patient with information at one visit, unless maybe that's their only visit. So this wouldn't all happen necessarily at one time. And of course, would be based on patient preferences as well. But some things thinking like, how do you align that her intake to be closer to a Mediterranean pattern, which, may be helpful depending on energy intake too, with some weight management. So increasing vegetables with a variety of those, so that we have a variety of dietary fibers that would be consumed, continue fruit intake, adding in whole grains in a incremental and experimental approach to accommodate family preferences, focusing on those healthful fats that are known to be also good for gut health, having some fish in the diet if that's a patient preference, including low-fat dairy, which is part of a Mediterranean pattern, is some dairy, but maybe having a little more gut-centered approach with doing some fermented dairy. And then you could, opt to focus on, consuming bananas, onions, leeks, garlic. I just think that this is a really patient-specific, question. And maybe like, will the person eat leek soup? I think it's good, but do you have to eat it all the time? How much onion can you use in things? So I think it's, just think about that from a practical perspective. And if that's something that you decide or the patient thinks is reasonable, that if you would like to add in inulin on top of that, that's an option. Like I said, the ISAP recommends generally 5 grams across the board for prebiotics, but of course varies per condition, maybe the type of prebiotic. And it does go up to, like I said, 30 grams in trials. One thing I also want to point out is that grams of prebiotics may not always be included on the labels. And so it's really, you can't look at a food label and necessarily say if it says 9 grams of fiber, one, you don't know if that's all the prebiotic. And two, is like, because of the FDA regulations on how what counts as fiber right now, it's a little bit, I don't want to say messy, but it's not as clear. And so they may not be captured in that. So I have this ingredient label here. So, and it may not say, for example, inulin, it could say chicory root extract. So there's lots of pieces there that may need to be put together to make it make sense for a patient. Considering side effects is important. So an incremental increase, you may not want to start out with your full dose, just in case. And then always, I would say, always practice with what you recommend. So if it's something you want to approach, then make sure you know how that person would use it. So does it soluble in water, which it is, this generally is, but it may not be for all fibers. So I have here our role is to thoughtfully guide patients and clients using current evidence and continue to follow and incorporate new literature. That's something we all understand, but it's, there's going to be lots and lots of new information out there over the next few years. So I only have a few minutes left. So I'm just going to end with a couple considerations and a summary. So first off, most patients will probably not be familiar with the term prebiotics. So we start talking about prebiotics, you have to step back and define it, because they may be familiar with the term probiotic, but they may not be familiar with the term prebiotic. So host genetics and gut microbial community may influence the ability of an individual to respond to prebiotic supplementation. So again, we don't react the same way to every dietary intervention. So what may be good for one person may not work as well for another. I've talked about prebiotics, but I really also focused on this idea of the importance of kind of surrounding that with a plant-based diet. And one of the reasons is that there's been some evidence that if there's a foundation established, like with gut bacteria, because of a plant-based diet consumption, that may allow that supplementation of a prebiotic specifically to work better. So if you have that gut bacteria present already because of what you're eating, then maybe it'll be better for that to have that prebiotic at that point. Also prebiotics, if you want to go that route, they can contribute to the fiber gap to get our daily fiber goal. Just because something's not a prebiotic doesn't mean it may not be beneficial. So there's some evidence for resistant starches, resistant maltodextrins. So keep your eyes and ears open for more evidence on that. And it certainly doesn't hurt to have a wide variety of fibers. And then of course, practical acceptability will depend on ease of recommendation and incorporation. So the more you help them and how to incorporate this, whether it's diet or fortified foods or supplements and how that's put into foods, they'll be more accepting of it. So it's just another summarization here is prebiotics. I think there's emerging health benefits, and some have, a fair amount now, but there's also optimism for use. So I think you're just going to hear more and more about this and how they're beneficial. So look for expanded substrates and concrete links to health benefits with new research. Foods and dietary patterns are important. So I would encourage, doing the holistic approach to modify gut bacteria for health benefit. So this is inclusive, but not just solely made up of the fermentable fibers and prebiotics. And I've mentioned several times, just really consider the individual. And so everyone's different. There's individualized conditions, individualized responses, and individualized preferences. All right, so this is all I had. Let me go turn on my video again. And then I will let, we have just a couple minutes. So if there's any questions that you have, Leslie's gonna manage that and let me know.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Heather. That was great. So I'm going to sort of start at the top and work our way down. So we'll kind of go back to the beginning a little bit of your presentation. A few people chimed in about non-nutritive sweeteners. So Donna specifically summed it up nicely. She's heard that many of the non-nutritive sweeteners can affect the microbiome. Is this true? And should dietitians be discouraging the use of them, or what's your thoughts there?
That's a very good question. So we actually use one non-nutritive sweetener when we do intestinal permeability, the test, sucralose. So it's kind of interesting that there is some evidence that it may impact it. I guess I don't feel like there's enough that I would say don't drink your Diet Pepsi that you love so dearly every day. So I would say I'm not super concerned about it, but I think that's another follow the literature. And if we feel like it's a consensus, then go ahead and make a reasonable replacement, recommendation for replacement.
Okay, fair enough. Okay, so shifting gears a little bit, lots of questions about inulin. So let's jump into some of those.
Okay.
Let's see. Okay, so from Barbara, is inulin added to foods just as helpful as inulin found naturally?
I guess to my knowledge, I would say yes, as long as that substrate is there, like if it's added to as chicory reducts to a granola bar, for example. So I don't know of any literature that says like naturally in foods is better than in added to foods. And I think the concern is it's just hard to get it naturally, that it would take a lot of consumption of those foods to get there. Not that we shouldn't try it, but it's just, I think, the fact.
Got it. Okay. So in that same vein then, based on your experience, how well is inulin supplementation tolerated?
So I think it depends also on the type of the inulin type structure. So there's like a range of inulin and inulin type fructans and fructooligosaccharides are all a little bit different. And so there's, depending on the exact one, I think it makes a difference. I would definitely start off with a lower dose, but I do think it can be very tolerable. But you have to really test that, because what could bother one person may be perfectly fine for someone else.
Right.
So
right.
I was just be cautious.
Okay, perfect. Because that was Bonnie kind of followed up with any thoughts if a person is not able to tolerate inulin and has uncomfortable GI symptoms. So your suggestion there would be to try different types to see what works the best for you. Obviously, everyone's an individual, so different preferences, different responses to different types.
Yeah, and there's a lot of, I mean, if we're talking brands of supplements, we're not, because I'm not going to talk about those. But there's options out there that you could explore. I just honestly, unfortunately, I think it's a little bit of just trial and error.
Okay. All right. Cool. Okay. Same vein with a little different of a spin from Lisa. What's your recommendation, inulin versus psyllium supplements for lowering cholesterol? Any thoughts there?
Psyllium's kind of our go-to, right? And so there's, I think, I want to say years of evidence that it can be helpful. I mean, it's not a magic bullet, right? But it can lower serum cholesterol, LDL cholesterol. And I would say there's not as many years of evidence for inulin related to that. So I wouldn't necessarily jump to that. I mean, granted, you have that benefit of modifying the gut bacteria a little bit more, so there could be additional benefits there. But I wouldn't just jump to replace psyllium with inulin.
Okay. All right, fair enough. All right, let's do one more. We're right at the top of the hour, but I think we've got a captive audience. So let's see. Okay, this is a good one to end on, I think. This is a nice general one. How quickly does the gut microbiota change with dietary change? For example, how quickly does one see a change after implementing an increase in vegetables or taking an inulin supplement, or fill in the blank here? Is there a time frame that RD should be thinking about for their patients?
It's a good question. I think everyone quotes generally the same paper that talks about how diet is rapidly changed, or gastrointestinal tract microbiota rapidly changed by diet. So it could be a day. So you could eat something one day and the next day it could look different. But I wouldn't say that would be what you should necessarily use as a measure. So it's like that changes bacteria, but then what are we really trying to do? We're trying to impact gastrointestinal health overall. We're, barrier function, we're trying to impact systemic health. So those changes take a little more time. So you may see those rapid shifts in bacteria with diet change, but you may not see those other effects for maybe several weeks or a month, depending what it is.
Okay, fair enough. Awesome. Well, thanks so much, Heather. That was great. There was a lot of excitement about the presentation today, lots of registrants, lots of sign-ons. So I want to thank you for sharing your expertise and joining us today.
Yeah, thank you, Leslie. Thank you, everyone, for coming.
And thanks again to the National Honey Board for supporting this excellent programming you just experienced. And as we do every webinar day, we talk about what's coming up next at this point in the show. So we're meeting again on Wednesday, September 21st from 2 to 3 p.m. Join Brenda Haig and David Haig for Health Literacy, Practical Interprofessional Strategies for Enhancing Health Equity. This is a big one. Brenda and David are going to discuss strategies to promote and enhance health equity and provide tips and tools that will impact how patients and clients perceive their own health and their health management. Register today at ce.todaysdietitian.com/health literacy. And your attendance certificates are now available to download. The credit claiming instructions are on the screen. They're on the last slide of the presentation handout. A handful of you said that you did not receive the handouts before the webinar started. They were emailed out about 12:30 Eastern time today. But when you go to claim credit, you'll get that email again, and it will have the handout link in there for you again. So with that, thanks everybody for joining us. Thanks again, Dr. Rasmussen. Everyone have a great afternoon and a really great, long, happy holiday Labor Day weekend.